Hello and welcome again to our program today. I'm Mike Hixson. So glad to have you with us. I've got Don Blackwell with me today. As you well know, Don is the executive director of GBN, and Don does a tremendous job leading the work in trying to get the gospel out to the world. And Don, so good to be with you.
Always good to be here, Mike. Love and appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you. And Don, today we want to talk about the role of elders within the grand scheme of the church, and to understand maybe first and foremost that organizationally speaking, God's plan is for the church to be overseen by men that meet the criterion set forth by the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, but they're to serve in a very specific task. It's a role of servanthood. It's not necessarily a position, but it's a role of service in the kingdom of God. And so let's just talk for a moment or two about God's plan for elders and the scope of their work.
You know, I appreciate what you said, that it's God's plan for the church to have elders. We see, number one, that the first century church had elders. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 30, we learn that the church in Jerusalem had elders. Acts 20 and verse 17, the church in Ephesus had elders. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1, Philippi had elders. The first century church had elders. And so we say we want to do Bible things in Bible ways. Secondly, the Bible specifically says that the church should have elders. Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul said to Titus, "For this reason, I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I have commanded you." So that's God's desire.
That's right.
That is God's plan. I know of a church that they were probably in excess of 400 members, and they didn't have elders.
Wow.
And a friend of mine said, "Why don't you have elders?" And he said, "Things are going so well, we don't want elders to come in here messing up things." Well, that's not right. That is not God's plan.
No, and you know, to assume that we know better than God.
Right.
And I think maybe touching on what you mentioned a moment ago in Titus chapter 1, verse 5, I know that there are some congregations that function from the vantage point that they allow the preacher to exercise oversight over the church. Typically, it's referred to as evangelistic oversight.
Yeah.
Paul instructed Titus in a very specific way to set in order the things that are lacking, which one of the things that would have been lacking was that divine government set forth by God in terms of elders overseeing the church, plural.
Yeah.
And I understand there are times when a congregation is not at that point where they're fully developed and can have overseers, but they ought to be working toward that aim. That ought to be their aim.
That's right. You know, somebody just asked me about this yesterday, and that is, they said if a congregation doesn't have elders, then how should they function? And I said they should function where the men come together and they have a men's business committee. Each man would vote. And she said, well, the reason I'm asking is, she said, our preacher says that in light or in lieu of there being elders, that the preacher runs the show. And she said he based it on this passage, Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, where Paul said to Titus, "I've left you to set things in order that are lacking." And she said he uses that passage to say the preacher runs the show. But the whole point there was the things that are lacking is you need to have elders. He says, set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders.
That's right.
That's the goal of the preacher.
And you know, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, you triggered a thought in my mind when Paul is writing to Timothy. And you remember his desire was to see Timothy, but he said, if I'm delayed, I'm writing these things so that you might know how to conduct or to behave yourself in the house of God. And so back in chapter 2, he's talking about elements of worship. In chapter 3, he's talking about the organizational structure of the church, which would encompass elders and deacons.
That's right. That's right. And so there is this idea that the preacher is in charge is not scriptural.
No, it's not.
In fact, it's really patterning itself after the denominational world.
Which is a one-man pastoral system, which is not biblical, never has been biblical.
That's right. That's right.
Don, when we look at the role of elders and their function, maybe Acts chapter 20 would be a good template for us to look at.
Sure.
Because the Apostle Paul has called for the elders of the church. You mentioned Ephesus had elders.
Yeah.
Paul is in Miletus. He calls for the elders of the church. And when they come to him, he reminds them of his ministry among them, that he had kept back nothing that was profitable or helpful to them. He pointed out that he was free from the blood of all men, not avoided to declare the whole counsel of God. And then in verse 28, Paul would say, therefore, in light of that, he said, you need to take heed to yourselves. And so first and foremost, he's telling them, you guys need to step back and evaluate your own lives.
Yeah, that's right. If you think Acts 20 is a great, great section to talk about elders and their responsibility. And if you want to think about it this way, it's a good outline for what elders owe a congregation, what a congregation owes elders. You could even draw some things there. But the first thing I would say is the point you're bringing out. What does an elder owe a congregation? Number one, he's got to take heed to himself.
Right.
Now, what does that mean? What would that involve? An elder's got to make sure, in fact, to take heed means to pay special attention to examine this, really give thought and focus to this, to yourself. So that means his own life. Are you controlling your own spirit? What about the way you behave? What about your study? What about your evangelism?
Sure.
What about the way you treat other people? Are you faithful in your attendance? Are you portraying Christ to the community around you? You make sure you've got your own life right. How can you lead other people if you don't have your own life right?
Yeah, I had an elder tell me on one occasion, he said, the church cannot rise above her elders. I think that's so true. And Peter, of course, in 1 Peter chapter 5, talks about how elders are to be examples to the flock.
That's right.
And I also think about the gravity of the work itself. For a man who has assumed this role, to understand the magnitude of responsibility resting on his shoulders, that this is not something that you enter into lightly, flippantly, but rather, if I understand Hebrews 13:17 correctly, they're going to give an account of the souls that are under their oversight. So you need to understand that you are putting your own soul on the line in accepting this role.
That's right. And 1 Peter 5, when he says to be examples, I think it matches perfectly with Acts 20:28. When you examine your own life, you've got to make sure you're right. Now, we both, I'm sure, we haven't talked about this, but we have known elders that haven't been faithful in their attendance.
Sure.
And so you'll have a man, he comes on Sunday morning, he doesn't come faithfully on Sunday night. Maybe there's a ball game going on, or, he's got family in town, and yet he's serving as an elder. He's missed this first point, what he owes the congregation. He's got to take heed to himself. How can you say, I'm not, I think about 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 27, the Apostle Paul said, I buffet my body daily, lest after I've preached to others, I myself should be cast away. Mm-hmm. That is, he said, I stringently watch myself.
That's right.
I control myself. It's akin to what he's saying here about elders. Take heed to yourself.
That's right.
Because if you don't have yourself right, then you can't lead others.
Yeah, Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 13 encouraged the brethren there. He said, examine yourselves whether you're in the faith. And I think self-evaluation is always a good thing, particularly in light of this role, to just sit back or maybe step back and to just evaluate, again, the gravity of the role. Am I meeting the expectations? And, Don, we've often said before, it's a whole lot easier to get a man into the eldership than get him out.
Yes.
And I think in many cases, we have not used wisdom. We haven't really used the Bible as the guide in terms of identifying those men to serve. And in many respects, we have put men in the eldership who are less than desirable in their attitudes, their attributes, and it shows.
I really think you're right. This goes back to the qualifications. If you have a man who's not faithful in his attendance, that probably didn't just start all of a sudden. Probably he did not meet the qualifications in the first place. But oftentimes, in fact, maybe we need to do some lessons on the qualifications.
Sure.
We put men in because they're well-liked, or they're businessmen, or they're a judge, or they have some prominent position in the community, and they don't really know the Bible. They're not really faithful. And so they don't meet the qualifications in the first place. So we shouldn't be surprised when they don't exhibit biblical qualifications of leaders.
Yeah, I think to your point, and for example, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 at verse 7, one of the qualifications of a man who would serve as an elder, he's not to be a novice in the faith.
That's right.
And then Paul told Titus that an elder is to hold fast the faithful word as he has been taught.
That's right.
And so an elder has to be very competent in Scripture. I always say, we use the word aptitude. There's a lot of difference in aptitude and ineptitude.
Yeah.
And sadly, we've put men in the role of elders that are deficient in their biblical knowledge. And you look at some of the problems that have made their way into the church. For example, how many congregations have adopted the instrument in their worship? Or they're allowing women to use, in their words, their talents to the glory of God in a public way. And yet that wasn't God's design. Now, I know maybe we're sort of running a rabbit trail here to some extent, but I think it's imperative for us to talk about this, because if you don't have the right men in the church leading a congregation, then apostasy is a very real danger. And that's exactly what Paul's talking about here.
Titus 1 verse 9, right after giving the qualifications of elders, the New King James says, holding fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convict those who contradict. Now, there's several things to unpack there. Number one, he holds fast the faithful word. That means he has it. He's holding to the word of God. Mm-hmm. This man has some knowledge. This man has it in his heart. He's holding to it. Notice the next phrase, as he's been taught. So he's been taught the word. He holds to the word. He's able. And so he's skilled in the way he handles it. How skilled is he? By sound doctrine. He knows the sound word, and he is capable to exhort and to convict the gainsayers. I think the old King James says, those who contradict. So what that means, if we're going to put it on our modern language, here comes someone along and they're teaching error. This man has been taught the word, and he can handle it capably enough that he can go to him and he can say, number one, he recognizes it. Number two, he can shut it down.
Well, exactly. And, in that context, he talks about those who are vain talkers and deceivers. And he said they subvert whole households.
Yeah.
And it's in that context that he said you need to rebuke them sharply. And he also says whose mouths must be stopped.
I was going to say that. The old King James says whose mouths must be stopped. Well, that shows not only he's skilled to handle the word, but this man has some backbone. He can stand up. Some people have the idea that a leader just has to be sweet and calm and syrupy, but sometimes he's got to be strong. He's got to show backbone. When a false teacher comes along, and when he says you've got to stop their mouths, that doesn't mean you're ugly, but you're skilled enough that you can say, that's wrong, and I'll show you why. Why? Because here's sound doctrine. Here's what the word, here's book, chapter, and verse.
Yeah, you made me think about a couple of years ago, I was in it was a special forum one day. It was on a Thursday, and Glenn Colley was on the forum with me, and he was talking about elders. I think I was talking about deacons, but he was talking about elders. And he made a point that I thought, man, that is such a good point. And of course, Glenn's part of GBN now, and I'm so glad that he's here and that we have the opportunity to work together. But he said that there was a guy in a congregation that maybe his name had been put up as an elder, and maybe he met a lot of the criterion to serve. But he said, my problem is I'm just not confrontational. I just don't like. And I remember Glenn asked the question, okay, is he qualified if he's not willing to confront? And of course, the answer was no.
No.
And if you don't have the fortitude, the backbone, as you said, the courage and the conviction, which I think those two terms go hand in hand. You got to have conviction. This is what I believe. Then you have to have the courage to stand, even when it's not popular.
Yeah.
And that's not always easy to do, particularly when there's a lot of pressure on.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look back at some of the pivotal people this is getting beyond the scope of elders, but I thought about this last night as I was thinking of this program of men in the Bible that took some strong, hard stands. And I think about Phinehas from Numbers chapter 25. it got to the point that Israel had begun committing sexual immorality with the Moabite women, and they were worshiping the false god of Baal of Peor and provoking God's anger. And it got to the point that Phinehas saw an Israelite woman, Zimri, and an Israelite man, Zimri, who was bringing a Midianite woman, Cosby, and they were going to have relations together. Of course, this was wrong. And he came and he pierced them through with a spear, and he stopped it. And the Lord was pleased. Now, that's a different time. It's a different situation. But here was a man who took a strong stand, maybe a little bit softer, Nehemiah. You get to Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 25. Nehemiah says, "So I contended with them, and I struck some of them, and I pulled out their hair, and I made them swear by God, saying, you will not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons for yourselves." Now, again, it's a different time. But what it's showing is these were men that had backbone, who were strong. Who, I'm not advocating that we do that sort of thing today. I'm just showing the kind of backbone that a leader in God's people has to have.
Yeah, and you look at the other side of the coin. I think about Aaron. When Moses was on the mountaintop receiving the 10 Commandments, you remember the children of Israel, they questioned what happened to Moses. And so they asked Aaron, they said, "Make a God for us." And rather than Aaron standing up, and Aaron was Moses' right-hand man.
Yeah.
And he had, you think about his position, his prominence among the nation of Israel. If Aaron had said, rather than capitulating and really becoming complicit in the sin, if he had said, "Wait a minute, God just gave us the 10 Commandments. We're not to have any graven images. We're not to," and rather than staying the apostasy, he really fueled it.
Yeah.
And then look at the problems that resulted from that.
That's a great example. In fact, I just looked up the text here, Exodus, 32 and verse 25. At the end of that, it says, "Now when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained," and then it says, "for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among their enemies." Now that's very interesting. The people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them. Aaron was the leader. Of course, it wasn't elders, but the same principle, that Aaron had the responsibility here. But the people said, "No, this is what we want to do." And so Aaron said, "We got to go along with that." I'm familiar with situations where a congregation said, "This is what we want to do." The elders really didn't think it was best scripturally. It really wasn't in the best spiritual benefit, but that's what the people wanted to do. So often that has been the case.
I think that's a tremendous point for us to maybe think about for a moment or two, because I was just thinking about an eldership in the Memphis area that back a couple of years ago, they brought the instrument into one of their worship services. And one of the things that served sort of as a catalyst to doing this, they said, our young people, we've talked to our young people, they have a heart for God. And I guess basically they want it. And rather than seeing them go to places that offer instrumental music, we're going to just bring it in. That way they'll stay here. And I thought, whatever happened to standing up and saying, "Wait a minute, we can't do this. This is not biblical." But rather than standing up, they facilitated it. And what happened? Then you're talking about leaving what I believe to be just basic fundamental truths connected with New Testament Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. And in this same context in Acts 20, after telling them, "Take heed to yourselves and all the flock," and verse 29 ties into what you're saying. He says, "For this I know, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock." So you make sure you got your life right. You be looking out for the flock. Shepherd the flock. Why? Because I know savage wolves, false teachers are going to come in. And he's saying you're the one who's responsible to stop this. That's right. And back in verse 28, when he told them to not only take heed to themselves, but also to the church, and then their responsibility was to shepherd or feed the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. And number one, to understand that, look, the church doesn't belong to me. It's the Lord's church. Yeah.
And it is the blood-bought body of Christ. And I have a responsibility as an elder to protect that congregation.
That's right.
I'm trying to look out for the Lord's body. And then secondly, I've got to understand that there is always the danger. Brother Guy Woods used to say, we're always one generation away from apostasy. If we don't teach and preach, and if we don't really, Jesus said in giving the Great Commission, we're to go and make disciples of all nations. The second part of that is, teach them all things, whatsoever I've commanded you. And Brother Don, I think in many ways we have neglected what I believe to be just the ABCs of Christianity, the fundamentals of the faith. And so you got a generation or two that really doesn't know what the Bible teaches, and so they're open prey.
Well, what I think I have observed happening is that a congregation will maybe start drifting one way because of some kind of influence. Usually it's one or two people that are stirring it up, and they get a congregation going the wrong direction. And the elders, instead of putting their foot down and saying, no, we are the shepherds, we are looking out, they will say, well, we want to protect the unity, or we don't want the congregation to split. We don't want a lot of people to leave, and so we're just going to go along with this. I know of a congregation that reached out to me some time ago, and they said, we're going to redesign our building. We're going to put in a coffee bar, and we're going to start doing some things like this. And they said, the reason we're making these kind of changes, they said, is we want to keep the young people happy. We don't want to lose the young people. And so their focus was keeping a group of people happy. And that's not the focus of elders, is to keep people happy. When he says, I want you to take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, he says, because I know that savage wolves are going to come in. You are shepherds. If you take the idea of a shepherd, the shepherd's watching for the wolves, and he's constantly keeping his eye on this. And it goes back to what you were saying a minute ago, and that is, the shepherds have to be instilling these fundamentals into.
And Don, in Acts chapter 20, when Paul said to take heed to yourselves and to all the flock, the elders individually are under the oversight of the eldership collectively.
That's right.
And you've got an apostasy that's going to occur based on what Paul said within the eldership. So you're talking about people that are comrades. I mean, we know one another. We're familiar with one another. Well, back in Exodus chapter 32, you remember after the passage you read a moment ago about Aaron not restraining the people, Moses stood at the entrance of the camp and said, whoever is on the Lord's side, let him come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. And then here's what the text says. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side, go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, every man his companion, every man his neighbor. So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Now you think about, they had to stand toe to toe against their own family members. Sure. Sometimes we have to take a stand, and it might be we're standing against family and friends, but that's what truth demands.
That's right.
Sometimes there's a separation of what we call the wheat and the chaff,
that's
and
right.
Truth is the dividing line.
Yeah, and think about how strong a stance that was of what they did. That would be considered radical, outrageous to do that sort of thing. But if you think about elderships today, if we want to bring this and make modern day application, an eldership sometime is going to have to take a radical, strong stand, and it might upset some people, and some people might leave as a result.
You mentioned a moment ago the fact that there are some that are willing to compromise for the sake of what they call unity.
Yeah.
They lost 3,000 people. Now you talk about a radical surgical procedure. And Paul said a little leaven leavens a whole lump. Sometimes division is necessary to keep the church where it needs to be.
Yeah.
That's not always easy to say, but it's true.
That's right. That's exactly right. I've heard churches say, well, if we don't stop teaching on this subject, whatever it is, marriage, divorce, or drinking, we're going to lose 30 people. And do you know how much those people give? These are people that give a lot. And so they're basing their decision on the attendance board and the numbers there and on money, how much money people are giving. That should never, ever be the basis of an eldership's decision. An eldership that is thinking that way is mixed up. They're not qualified to be elders because they're not focusing
on
the things that God tells them to focus
That's right.
on.
That's right. So we go back to our text in Acts chapter 20. You remember in verse 31, Paul said to the elders of the church, therefore watch. To maintain this vigilant spirit, do you think sometimes maybe elders fail to understand that part of their role in terms of being vigilant and really watching out for the flock?
I really do. I really do, because I think for some elders, they've become like a board meeting. They meet once a week or once a month, and they make decisions about, what color are we going to make the carpet? What are we going to do at the next fellowship? A godly elder is constantly vigilant. He's watching. And notice what he says. Remember that for the space of 3 years, I did not cease to warn you night and day with tears. So night and day, all the time, not once a week, not once a month. Paul said, I was always watching. I was constantly on guard. And when he says, I was watching and I did it night and day, and then you add the tears, this was heart-wrenching.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. And again, you go back to, okay, so what is it that's going to keep a congregation strong? Well, I think about what Paul said in verse 27 when he just plainly says, I did not shun, I did not avoid to declare to you the whole counsel of God. He prefaced that by saying, I kept back nothing that was profitable or helpful to you. Elders have to ensure that the church is taught. And I've said this before, and I think it's really something that elderships need to think about. I know what people want sometimes.
Yeah.
My job is not to give people what they want, but to give them what they need.
That's right.
And from a biblical perspective.
That's right. It's kind of like a parent and children, that a child, if you let them have what they want, it will be to their own destruction. And you're going to have to punish them. You're going to have to discipline. I'm not saying that elders, what I'm saying is they're the leaders, and that they are going to bring up these people who are new converts, and they've got to teach them. They've got to feed them. And if you just give them what they want, it's going to be to the destruction of the church.
That's right. Don, I know we got about a minute left, but in terms of closing remarks or maybe some advice to elders based on what we've talked about thus far, what would you say by way of closing to elders today?
I think the one thing that I'm latching on to right here, when Paul says that what he did, warning them night and day, he says with tears, it tells me the work of an elder is rewarding, but it's not always fun.
Well, that's so true.
It can be very, very painful. It's not a fun thing, but ultimately we're looking for the reward hereafter, both for ourselves and for the flock.
Sure. And, to realize that the tears are on behalf of the Lord's body.
That's right.
His redeemed. And when we love something, we're willing to put our heart and soul in it. And elders that are worth their salt, they're willing to do that.
That's right.
So good to be with you, Don, and thank you for being with us today. We hope that you'll come back and be with us again next week. Until then, may the Lord bless and keep you.